Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, the black and gold standard for Pittsburgh Steelers coverage. Now, here's your host, Brian E. Roach.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. My name is Brian Roach, the host who, as you may or may not know, does not like toast. And today, for this edition, we have a special edition of the podcast. We're going to be talking to Brett Abrams, who is a sports historian and author and has recently published a book called Terry Bradshaw, From Super Bowl Champion to Television Personality. Brett, welcome aboard the podcast.
Oh, welcome. Thank you very much. Nice to be in the Steel City.
Absolutely.
Underground.
Underground, that's right. So you got an opportunity or took an opportunity to write a book about a guy who is a lightning rod within the Pittsburgh sports environment, Terry Bradshaw. How did that all come about, and what kind of drove you to write this book?
Well, I'd written a book about the Washington, D.C. basketball history, which covers from the 1920s to 2010s. And a person who had read the book and has also written sports history gave me an opportunity to write a book about sports idols who have become pop culture icons. And after thinking about a few people like James Brown, or Jim Brown, I should say, who has done the Dirty Dozen, and Ice Station Zebra, but was also, of course, an incredible football player, I thought, well, what about a good old boy? Like, I know nothing about good old boys, as I quickly learned, and Terry Bradshaw popped into my mind, and I realized that I knew only a little about Terry Bradshaw. So I started to investigate him, and as always, he continues to keep doing more and more stuff. So he became fascinating to me.
Yeah, he is an enigma wrapped up in a riddle, wrapped up in a cloudy day that hides the sun. He's perplexing, I think, to many of the members of Steelers Nation. And as we'll get into when we talk about this, you know, he's much more than Terry Bradshaw, the quarterback. But when we start, you know, you begin with his roots, which are in the South, and you know, you talk about him as a good old boy, and certainly he had that little Abner type stereotypes pushed against him when he first came to Pittsburgh. But talk a little bit about his upbringing in the South and why that made him coming to Pittsburgh why that might make it such a culture shock for him.
Right. Okay. So Terry grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, and from a working class family, and on his mom's side, and father's side, they were farmers, and they were pretty dirt poor. He talks about using an outhouse when he was a kid. He loved Southern gospel, white gospel music, which of course is associated with, at least old-timey gospel is associated with white, good old boy, working class, roots, Southerners. And of course, very Protestant, went to a Baptist church and cared intensely about those things as a child. But of course, most importantly, was football. And the area in which he came from, and Louisiana in general, has an incredible passion for high school football and its importance to community and to the whole culture at large. And he played for a high school called Woodlawn, which had a history of really great quarterbacks, including a guy by the name of Terry Prater, who went on to play at LSU, Terry Bradshaw himself, and then Joe Ferguson right after Terry Bradshaw. Terry took the team to the high school state championships, and they didn't win, but all these things formed an incredible passion for him. And of course, the kind of sports that he liked was AFC football. Open, lots of long passes, the whole Sid Gilliam style with the Mad Bombers, John Hadle, that kind of quarterback play. So that was the roots of Terry. And then he went to Louisiana State, and he went there because basically that's where the people from Woodlawn went. And he was getting a lot of grief from his coach and others about even thinking about going to LSU. His girlfriend went to Louisiana Tech. She gave him grief. And he decided that it was better not to get grief. So he went there, and that actually was a fateful decision. Little did he know that that would come back and play into his stereotype, as you know, the Pittsburgh media and others raised that question.
Absolutely, that's an interesting, take and I guess insight into, why Bradshaw in many ways was as he was when he got to Pittsburgh, because he was different than anything I think Pittsburgh had seen in the past. Any kind of player, any kind of athlete. He was more. He was louder. He was confident. He was brash, and at the same time, he made a lot of sweeping statements about how he was going to. How they were going to become winners and these things, which didn't quite pan out the way I think anybody thought they would initially. Coming in as the number one draft pick to Pittsburgh, he was stereotyped with being not just, a little Abner type, but dumb. And, I guess that's not really the case with Bradshaw at all, is it?
Right, exactly. But it wasn't just he who made the brash statements. There were people like Ray Manor at the time who said that Bradshaw was going to be the Moses that was going to take the team out of the dumps that they had been in for the last 40 years, for mostly their entire existence, and bring them to the promised land. And he did win. They went from a one-win team to a 5-win team in that first year. But what Bradshaw also faced was the fact that Terry Hanratty had been drafted as a quarterback the year before by the Steelers from Notre Dame. Hanratty was half Irish, half Italian. He was Catholic. He came from Butler, Pennsylvania. He was a lot more like the people around the Pittsburgh area than Terry Bradshaw was. So they rooted for Hanratty. And Hanratty and Bradshaw traded off the quarterback starting position for the first 2 to 3 years that Bradshaw was there. And Bradshaw also was a personality that kind of was very loquacious, would say things that were rooted in his Southern existence that kind of baffled the Pittsburgh media. And so the Pittsburgh media did label him as Little Abner in shoulder pads. And Little Abner, of course, is from Dogpatch, which is Appalachia, which is nothing like the Louisiana area where Bradshaw came from. So it was basically playing on Southern stereotypes that Pittsburgh and other northern cities had since the 1930s, because that's when Little Abner was actually a popular comic, even though it lasted through the 1970s. So Bradshaw was fighting a little bit of an uphill battle in the perception of him as a figure. And it didn't help that he would take risks when he played quarterback.
Right.
And that was, again, the AFC football way. It doesn't matter how many interceptions you throw, as long as you're throwing one or more touchdowns as well.
Right. It's a much different style of football than what the NFL at the time embraced. And,
right.
Before we get into that, let's talk about the other part of this culture shock for Bradshaw coming up to Pittsburgh is, from his roots and from where he's coming from, you're talking about small town kind of guy, a rural kind of guy, and Pittsburgh is probably the biggest place he's ever been at that point
Correct.
in his life. So that in and of itself also had to be an additional culture shock, just adjusting to the size and nature of a more urban environment like Pittsburgh.
Right, and a shot and beer town, and a town that's very parochial, like a lot of towns are. I mean, we think about Boston and others as being sophisticated, but if you went to Southie you better be Irish.
Yeah.
And so in Pittsburgh, there were these clusters of living arrangements. On the Hill were African Americans, Polish in certain areas, Italians in other areas. And Terry's none of those things.
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
He's already a fish out of water. And then as a shot and beer kind of town, I mean, there's great stories about Bobby Lane, which you probably know, many more of them than I do. But the whole Pittsburgh Steelers team was, we'll drink at the local bar, which was right outside of it was the Chido Tavern, Chido Tavern was the big place that they went to. And these guys would just lap it up with the fans and have a great old time and then go out and play the next day. I mean, that's not what professional football was transitioning. It was what it was transitioning away from rather than transitioning into. So the fans were losing that kind of close contact with the players, which is something that they begin to resent in the next couple of years. But also the kind of teams that Pittsburgh had were so bad that basically what the fans were rooting for was for players to smash the heads of the other team. And that was what they wanted. And of course, as an offensive player, you're not doing that by nature anyway. But that's not the way that Terry or other people conceived of football.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned earlier, the other thing about this change for Bradshaw is he's coming into an environment where Chuck Noll is trying to build a system that is different than what's been there in the past. And Noll, as a disciple of Brown and Shula and others, is much more of a traditionalist in the way that NFL football should be, right? It's a ground and pound, pass only when necessary. That mentality that when you throw the ball, three things can happen and two of them are bad, kind of a concept. Right. And that's wildly different from the type of football Bradshaw was used to playing. And so you kind of have a guy who is floundering with the societal aspects of this move, as well as just what should be the comforting aspect, which is playing football, as well as that, because Noll wants him to change his game, essentially.
Right. Despite the fact that in some cases Terry was calling the plays. The kind of concept was, this is the range of plays that you're supposed to call. I'm expecting more of a ground game. And they didn't really have a great runner until 1972.
Right.
And then when Franco Harris comes along, all of a sudden you notice that the system starts working much more proficiently than it had in 70 and 71, which were Bradshaw's first 2 years. So I think that's very interesting in its own light. The fact that also Franco being an Italian and being African American was embraced. There was, of course, the crazy fans that he had, Franco's Italian Army, which included Frank Sinatra and Henry Mancini. I love the stories of them calling to say, I want to be part of this army. How do I get to be part of this army? I mean, Girella's Gorillas, a kicker has his own fan base, I mean, yes, there was Bradshaw's brigade, but it wasn't that big. I mean, I think Jack Ham's Sobre group, I think there's a way of saying Sobre Dorka, which is like, Yugoslavian or something like that for Ham. Those were much bigger groups than Bradshaw's group. And then the other thing that Bradshaw wasn't used to was he grew up in an environment in which, in both high school and college, nobody booed. And then when you come to the professional ranks, well, if you make a mistake, and as we've seen over and over again, if you do something that's not conceived of as proper by the fans, A, you will hear it via the boos, or B, they'll throw something at you. And guess what? They perceive of that as their right, because they paid the ticket. So that was something that was very shocking. The negative aspect of playing professional football was incredibly shocking to him. And then, of course, Chuck Noll had a personality that was quite different from Terry Bradshaw. And so their bumpy road began right away. Although Chuck does say, and you see evidence of this by 1972-74, that yes, he supports Terry, and yes, he says Terry is not dumb, and Terry is calling his own plays. But on a personal level, and the idea of embracing both literally and figuratively the Terry, that's not what Chuck Noll's going to do. That's not who Chuck Noll is. And Terry needed that because that's what he liked. That's what he was used to. And he was not going to get it from a Paul Brown disciple.
Yeah. It's interesting that
and a man who played on the line. I mean, and was kind of he was a messenger for Paul Brown. And I think he tells a great story about how, no, the reason why Terry called his own plays, part of that was because he resented how plays were shuttled in by Paul Brown during the era in Cleveland where Chuck Noll played on the line. And Chuck Noll was often the messenger.
Yep.
So I'm sure Chuck Noll could see what the quarterback, whether it's Luke Rosa or somebody else, how they would respond.
Yeah,
to that.
I agree.
Probably
I think
incredibly negative.
Yeah, it's it was a challenging relationship from the get-go, as you said, and I think it kind of speaks to talent level. It kind of speaks to dedication that, despite all of these negatives, they eventually found a way to make it work. But it wasn't, I guess what you'd call smooth sailing right away. And in fact, Bradshaw had to deal with a lot of turmoil and, strife early in his career, even to the point where he got benched, when Joe Gilliam came in and kind of lost his role and had to be ready to get it back and make that kind of recovery. And I know that, Terry's talked at times about, depression and battling being depressed and his personal life at the time. So, it still kind of speaks to some strength of character within him to a certain extent to be able to recover from, those downturns.
Correct. I mean, the whole Joe Gilliam story is fascinating because in 1974, the players decided to go on strike for the first time. And Terry did walk out with the players and then realized, because Joe Gilliam was a rookie, that Joe Gilliam was actually doing extremely well. And they had missed the first exhibition game. And then some of the stars, and this happened again in other strike situations, some of the stars actually walked across the line. Bradshaw realized that if he didn't go back, that he might lose his job. And in fact, he did lose his job. First 7 games of that 1974 season, that was Joe Gilliam, that quarterback, until they realized that Joe Gilliam was frequently making mistakes, as a rookie would.
Absolutely.
As any rookie would. And they decided to go back, and then it became a 3-headed monster. It was Hanratty getting some opportunities, Bradshaw getting some opportunities, and Gilliam getting some opportunities, until finally, towards the end of the season, Chuck Noll decides, no, this is it. Terry Bradshaw is my man. And they go on from there to go against the Vikings in the 74 Super Bowl in Tulane, in New Orleans.
Yeah, and one of the things, my daughter, of course, is very enamored of the Steelers. I have no idea why. Gee, it makes no sense, right? Being my daughter, but she's very interested in the history of the Steelers, and she's watched a variety of shows and programs about the history of the Steelers, and read books about the history of the Steelers, and she's met Franco, she's met Joe Green, she's met Rocky and a variety of other of the all-time greats. And those wow. legendary players are the guys that she likes even better than the players today, because she loves the stories and she loves, the things that went on in the past. And one of her favorite things is in one of the players, and I think it's Rocky Blyer, but it might have been Andy Russell, in one of those DVDs says that Joe Green saved Terry Bradshaw's career. And so she repeats that. And one of her great joys or hopes in her life is that she wants to meet Terry Bradshaw and tell him that. I've told her she can't do that, but she may one day meet Terry, but she can't go up to him and go, did Joe Green save your career? But to a certain extent, there is some truth to that, in the sense that, when Bradshaw's time was down and when there was a lot of questions, and even when he got his job back, the team wanted other players. They wanted either Hanratty, they wanted Gilliam, and Joe Green essentially said, "No, Brad's our guy." And as Rocky Bleier says, when Joe says something is one way, it's that way. And but I wondered, from the standpoint of a fan, you can see, okay, I can see some grain of truth. But from the standpoint of Terry, how does he view that whole time frame, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe that Terry would prefer not to even think about it, to be honest with you. He had to go through, he's written about it in his books, and he went through an awful lot, but it was great for him in some respects because it helped him renew his Christian evangelical beliefs and come to a feeling of, this is what I need for my life, that I am a believer in Jesus Christ, and that is my primary focus. It helped him move away from the kind of partying that he was doing, which was one of the few times that I've ever come across a discussion about partying and Terry Bradshaw. That just was not ever part of his personality. And of course he was doing that partly because it was fun, and partly it was because he wasn't sure of himself as he was being bounced around as to when he was going to be the quarterback. And then he had that reputation of being a dummy that really became national once the Steelers made the 1974 Super Bowl. 600 media people, and they're asking you, how does it feel to be likened to Little Abner? And then even after winning, they said, "Does this make you feel better? Now, how do you want to comment about being called a dumb country bumpkin and then leading the team to victory?" And Terry's like, "I don't even want to talk about this." And of course, it continued because everybody's perception of the '74 Steelers was they won through defense and running. Franco Harris sets a record in the Super Bowl at that time for most yardage, and it was perceived that they won despite Terry Bradshaw, rather than because of Terry Bradshaw. And that doesn't change until really after the next Super Bowl against the Cowboys, where Terry throws the successful long pass that basically left him on the ground completely and utterly unconscious. And the next time he comes to awakening, he's laying in the locker room with his father on over the top of him, basically saying, hello, are you there? That was the amazing end to the last 2 minutes of the Super Bowl 10.
Yep, absolutely. And, it's interesting, though, because, after that Super Bowl and in between the next time the Steelers appeared, the league decided they wanted to embrace that concept of AFC football, that more wide open type of football, and they made rule changes to help them do so. The so-called Mel Blount rule, where you couldn't do what the Steelers had become adept at with receivers, and basically kind of hold them onto the line, not let them break away, keep tormenting them all the way down the field, and we got a chance to see Bradshaw then embrace his roots, so to speak, and the way he likes to play football. And the Steelers, rather than fading away because they're just a defensive team, again emerged and won 2 more Super Bowls, with Bradshaw really leading the way through, lighting up the field with, long passes, short passes, and doing the things that he enjoyed. So, right. You have the opportunity to see he had that kind of talent even beforehand. Maybe they didn't have the weapons for him to do it until they got Lynn Swann and John Stallworth in fold.
Right.
But you did get to see both sides of that story, and even during that time, when you've looked back at this, so even during that time where now Bradshaw is truly the field general, Bradshaw is really, the main part of the engine that's making the team go. How did the fans and the media embrace him then?
Oh, the fans totally loved him by that point, especially with the Well, once they beat Dallas again in Super Bowl 13, that was big. And then the Los Angeles game, so he won the 2 MVPs of the Super Bowl. So how could the fans not love him as a quarterback? And that's when he really becomes the sports idol in Pittsburgh. But what Bradshaw always kept in his craw, for lack of a better term, was the old days. And he remembered the 1973 fans who, when he got dumped on his shoulder and basically came up in the Cincinnati Bengals game, came up holding his arm, the fans were cheering because he was knocked out of the game. And even Paul Brown said at that point that it was a despicable behavior by the Steelers fans for cheering for the lack of, for Bradshaw being knocked out of the game. So that's something that Bradshaw always kept with him. So he had a love-hate relationship with the fans.
Absolutely.
And that would continue.
Yeah, I agree. And that's where I was kind of leading to this, because, you know, there's a couple of points that you make and that I think in the book that I think are apropos of who Bradshaw is and how he moves on. But there's also in as you say, in his holding certain things within his craw, an aspect of not being able to let go of the past, even though he tends to constantly state that he just wants to live in the now and in the future and keep moving. And obviously his relationship with not only the fans but the city and the team has gone through a variety of different metamorphoses over the years as he moved into broadcasting. You know, as his career on the field went down, obviously there's, you know, the episodes of him unloading on Chuck Noll, calling him a jerk in the booth, and a variety of other things that began to distance and sour the relationship between Bradshaw, the team, and the fans, if in fact it was ever really good. And I do question sometimes where that fault truly lies, if there is even fault, because when you come off of the kind of high that he had winning those last 2 Super Bowls, even though, you know, his last year may have not been the way he wanted it to go or the way he wanted to go out, you know, the fans had, as you said, they really had no choice but to embrace him. How do you not embrace a guy who's performing at that level and leading you to Super Bowl victories? And I think they had, and that's just the fickle nature of fans. But it seems like Bradshaw could have fed off of that. But as soon as the career ended and he moved on, it really seemed like he wanted to push that away and distance himself from that and create a new Bradshaw that was distinct and separate from Bradshaw, the quarterback.
Right. As you say, there's a lot of stuff in the book. I think you have to already start in 1981. So the team wins the 2 Super Bowls. Then the next year they do not. And he's in Hollywood and he's making Burt Reynolds movies and he's making Cannonball Run 1. And in that, they realize that him and Mel Tillis have an incredible rapport, and they're funny together. So they create a pilot called The Stalkers, and they air that on NBC, and it doesn't get picked up, but it might have been picked up. And my argument in the book is, had that not come out in April, but had come out after the Cannonball Run movie had come out, which was June, it might have very well have been successful, because then the characters would have been recognized. And then people might have said, yeah, this is funny. In which case, then Terry would have given up his last 3 years as a football quarterback and instead become an actor. So fans don't forget that. I mean, I don't have a problem with Steelers fans looking at him going, excuse me, you're doing what? Who's going to be our quarterback? So that already starts this kind of mixed relationship that he has with the fans. And then you're right, because he makes it worse in a way by being his blunt, honest self and criticizing Chuck Noll for his last several years with the Steelers, which were rough. I mean, you've got to admit that maybe time had passed in Chuck Noll's assessment of talent and what he put together.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And there's obviously when you're drafting at the bottom of the draft every year, you are not getting the same quality player that you have to choose from when you're always drafting at the top levels. But I think the interesting thing to me with all this is as Bradshaw progresses on, and I think part of what a lot of fans cannot figure out, and maybe no one can, including Bradshaw himself, is that given every opportunity to try and mend a fence or to make a show that, towards reconciliation, even up to this previous week, Bradshaw seems to always want to take the push away or slap that aside approach. He doesn't go to Art Rooney's funeral. He doesn't go to Dan Rooney's funeral. He doesn't go to Chuck Noll's funeral. Calls Mike Tomlin a cheerleader. When a year later asked about it, says, I have no opinion of Mike Tomlin, when anybody who watches the show knows, even if Bradshaw's not a film rat anymore, even if he's not a guy who has to study film every week for his job, part of his job is assessing the talent on the field for Fox Sports. He has to have some opinion of Mike Tomlin. I mean, there has to be something there. But there is a consistent choice, it feels like, and at some point it really feels like a choice to continue the feud. And I wonder if that all stems back to, as you said, the slight that he feels from early in his career, and that still nagging at him.
Yeah, there's no question about his choices, and most of them have been to push away. And then he doesn't quite, it starts with his retirement. I've talked about this on other occasions as well. I think he makes a terrible choice about where he actually retires. He retires at the CBS headquarters in New York, where he announces that he's taking on the color commentator job instead of going back to Pittsburgh and doing it where any old gunslinger would do it, which is you do it in the town that you made safe in the great westerns of the era. That's where you go right to the face of the people and you tell them it's all great. We've had a wonderful romance, or I've saved the day. Now I'm walking on, and then you head off into the setting sun and you're done. And everybody gets the chance to have their closure. But instead, he denied the people the opportunity to have their closure. And if that's one thing that I hold him accountable for in the book, that's it. I think he starts right there. The other stuff about being critical about Chuck Noll and his choices, that's part of his job. I don't have a problem with that. Fans can have a problem with that because they look at it and they say, you shouldn't be negative about the team that helped you. Why are you biting the hand that feeds you or that fed you? And, that was part of his job. But you're right. Missing the funerals, again, not excusable. The only thing I can think about in his personality is he claims he's always looking forward, and he sort of always does look forward, is that he just didn't want to face the ugly. The natural part of life, which is the death part.
Yeah, and that's a viable point, and but there certainly is, a different view of Bradshaw, I think, especially in his later part of his career, and I think you bring this out in the book very well, where, as you just said, you talk about his stated view of himself as always looking forward, even though I think actions sometimes say that he holds on to the past. He also does tend to just move on. And in a lot of ways, when he's done with one aspect of his life and he's moving to the next, that other thing is just in the past. And now his focus is forward. It happened with his broadcasting career. It happened when he was doing acting, which, now he has, he has another show on national television with, Shatner and I can't, Fonzie. Yeah.
Better never. Right. Exactly.
And so, he's continually remaking himself, which is, I think, one of the main messages of the book is that Bradshaw he's not just the little Abner guy from Louisiana. He's not just the Super Bowl winning quarterback. He's not just the broadcaster or the actor. He's all of these things and more, and constantly evolving as he moves through his life.
Exactly. Yet he's that persona. He bitterly talks about it on Fox one time with both Howie Long and Jimmy Johnson about how he felt he had no choice but to embrace the dumb Southern good old boy personality. But then he markets it like you would not believe. And every commercial, whether it's the 10-10, 220 cards that we used to have to use when we wanted to get cheaper long distance, where he's playing with Mike Piazza or Doug Flutie, and he's being a goofball, or he's being a goofball when he's selling you a home loan mortgage, or he's being a goofball when he's doing the Visa commercials, or now, of course, he's kept up with the generation of people that know who he is, and he's selling them anti-shingles products.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, he's marketing this persona, but at the same time, he's saying, "Why does everybody see me this way?" Well, yes, maybe once in a while you present the serious guy who's able to assess domestic violence, or who's able to say that, you know, Greg Hardy shouldn't be playing in the NFL, or why do we have tolerance for this, or I don't understand why players would be wearing their ring when they're practicing and then all of a sudden they can't find their ring anymore and it's worth $100,000. I mean, why are you so stupid? Is basically the way Terry analyzed this situation for this Miami Dolphin offensive lineman who had lost like $100,000 ring while he was practicing. It's like, yeah, okay, we hear you, but every 5 times you're being the goofball for the one time that you're serious. So how do you know that that 5 to 1, the ratio is of course going to make people think more about you as this is who you are, this goofball, Southern good old boy, as opposed to a serious, analytical, highly intelligent, motivated person. You know, there's always a difference between the persona, which is what we market, and the root personality that's underneath that all. There are similarities, but the root personality, of course, doesn't necessarily come through, and it's not the fun thing that is what people want when they want you to do their commercials or when they want you to be on their movies, which is the latest movie he's doing called Father Figures with J.K. Simmons and Vin Rhames.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, he's in that. What's interesting is the same kind of thing that bugs him about persona versus personality and people's misperceptions of him is the same kind of thing that we're talking about where he's not, how he deals with the Pittsburgh fans. He wants one thing, but he behaves in a different way most of the time. So he's never going to get the one thing that he wants because what he's showing the people frequently in his actions is the opposite or something contrary.
Absolutely. That's, I think, part of the frustrating part in examining Bradshaw is that he embraces the persona and at the same time, and as you said, markets that persona because it's what is wanted and what is desired and what people expect from him. But at the same time, wants everybody to know that's not him and to see beyond the persona. So he pushes it and expects everyone to not acknowledge it to a certain extent, or to not legitimize it, even though he's doing so by marketing it and putting it out there as much as he does, because there's no question with personality and the cult of personality, it's that persona that becomes the person regardless of fact. Right. And that's how we see him. So before we close everything down, I mean, I want to encourage everybody to go ahead and you know, take a chance, read the book, buy a copy of the book. It's well worth the effort and the time and the money. It's an enjoyable read, and you're going to learn a lot of things. But from your researches, you know, tell the guys who are listening, the folks who are listening, what's something that about Bradshaw that we haven't talked about yet, but that maybe they would not ever have imagined to be true?
Yeah, that's a really tough question if I think about that. Oh, wow. What is something about Bradshaw? Well, one of the things that I liked about him and that struck for me is the fact that the man can actually sing. I mean, I found a YouTube video. By the way, if you do get the book and you actually I know many people don't look at the footnotes, but one of the things about looking at the endnotes is you'll get little web locations where you can actually see Terry acting and you can see Terry singing. And one of my favorite ones is when he went on Hee Haw and he sang "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry." And I played that for a bunch of people in Louisiana at a history talk that I gave a month ago. And they were all flabbergasted by the fact that, wait, he can actually carry a tune. The man can sing. No, despite he's singing old-time Southern country songs, which, when he was singing them were out of date. So you can only imagine how far out of date they are now.
Oh, yeah.
But the man can actually sing. And I've seen him, I have some YouTube sites where he sings gospel. And it's kind of amazing. He's singing in these churches and he's really belting out. And it's great fun. And you really kind of sit there and you have to respect the fact that the man can carry a tune, that the man knows, he knows his lyrics. Oh, the great story that reminds me of. The best and funniest thing that I thought of was when he sang with Paul McCartney. He started singing "It's a Hard Day's Night" in the Super Bowl when McCartney was there on halftime. And you would not believe how many fans were pissed. Not Steeler fans per se, but Beatles fans. People were up in arms that Bradshaw dare sing with a Beatle. And that Sir Paul McCartney would lower himself to sing with this ex-football player. And the things that these people say on their websites, when you read it, you're like, oh my God, they would have ripped this guy another butthole if they could have. They were so angry.
Yeah, as bad as it was for Bradshaw early in his career, I think he can be thankful that it wasn't now. Because internet trolls and internet muscles and the courage of an anonymity certainly would, for anyone with even a remotely fragile ego, could be devastating and crushing at this point. With the way that social media works and different eras. So I guess he's lucky there was no Twitter and no no Facebook and no social media posting when he was actually playing, because can you only imagine?
You have to read these comments, though, because they are so funny. They're madder, if not as mad at Paul as they are at Bradshaw. And now Bradshaw does screw up the lyrics, too, which is what made me remember the story, is that Bradshaw starts wrong right away. And they're just horrified. But it's so much fun to imagine, all these people sitting there. And not necessarily the trolls who are always angry, but the people who are really legitimate Beatles fans who are horrified. Horrified. And in some respects, jealous.
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah.
They're jealous. They're like, oh my God, this man, he got the opportunity to sing with Paul McCartney, and I wish I could,
Well, of course, absolutely.
But that's my favorite thing. That was just so funny. I'm not like that. So for me, the humor of it is that all these people are sitting at home pulling their hair out if they have any hair left, because they're so distraught. I just love the idea of thinking about these people being so distraught over something so absolutely minuscule.
Yeah, absolutely.
And completely unimportant, but not for them. And it might even scar them for the rest of their lives,
Well, yeah, I can't imagine why, but I guess it's true.
We can only hope.
Yeah.
We can only hope.
So, Brett, I want to thank you again for joining us. I think, you've provided a lot of insight into a person who is not well understood by Steelers Nation. So let everybody know if they want to follow you, if they want to, see what else you've done. How can they get you on the interwebs and out there in social media?
Yeah, my location is, I'm called Bohemian Yankee in the capital since I live in Washington, D.C. Actually, you can just write me at blabrams2@gmail.com if you have anything, or bla2222.wordpress.com.
Excellent. All right. So, again, everybody, the book is Terry Bradshaw, from Super Bowl champion to television personality. It's by Brett Abrams, and that's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. Until next time, everybody, remember, it's chaos out there. Be kind.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.